this episode, we're going to cover some resources that have been helpful to us navigating PTSD. We did this episode over a couple of days, so lighting, clothing, and so on change throughout the video. Hopefully that isn't too distracting for you. And one quick disclaimer, we aren't being paid to give our thoughts on any of these resources. Okay, let's jump in. So I'm going to start out with the first book that I read about PTSD that Brian brought home. I don't know where he saw it or got a hold of it, but it is called Why Is Dad So Mad? A book about PTSD and military families by Seth Kastle. It's a children's book, so it's got some great illustrations in here. And it kind of talks, it's for military families, so it talks about why dad came home and is different, more angry, less patient, struggles with things. But, you know, it's just real quick, short, easy to digest for kids. I've read it to the kids numerous times. It's kind of seen better days. It's a little bent up and stuff. But it was a good introduction for me and I think the family. I think Brian was in therapy maybe at the time when we got this book, and kind of put into words some of the things Brian had been saying over the years, just a little bit differently, and was good for the kids. And we read it to the younger kids, but I noticed the older kids kind of listening, and I saw them pick up the book and read it. So even though it's pretty simple, it's a good resource. So highly recommend that one.
There's one out there called Why Is Mom So Mad also. That's same topic, military spouse coming home to their family.
Yep. So our next resource is a book called A Mind Frozen in Time by Jeremy P. Crosby. It looks like this. And this one we have two bookmarks in here. I haven't read very much of this one yet. This one Brian's gotten a little further in. And it's a book for all survivors of traumatic experiences, not just military, and for their families. And the little blurb thing says it is designed to function as a PTSD guide to recovery by helping individuals develop basic understanding of PTSD, introduce coping skills, and to aid in symptom management, as well as provide information about some of the more difficult issues that need to be addressed in PTSD therapy. What's interesting about this book is that it's organized as an outline. The whole book is in outline form, which is pretty great because it's easier to digest the information. And then also it's good as a reference. So if you're looking for specific information, it's easy to find and understand what you're getting. And this is for therapists, student therapy people, the person with PTSD, and for families. So good resource. I haven't read much of it. Did you have any thoughts?
It's been a good resource. The outline format is really quick and easy to get into and to make sense of. It was nice. It was the first book I read about PTSD, and it helped me feel like, oh, so this is a thing somebody's wrote a book about, and all these things I'm feeling and experiencing are right here in front of me. It must be a thing more than just me. I will add that it's a little spendy to buy, and it might be hard to find, but it's well worth it.
All right, so that's A Mind Frozen in Time. The one that I used was the PTSD Family Coach, and that was one that Brian turned me on to. It's an app from the VA, and it includes tools to help manage stress. It gives you mindfulness exercises, tools to help rebuild your social networks, and to help with difficult thoughts and emotions. It has tracking tools to give you feedback on your stress levels and how you're doing with that and progress. And finally, the PTSD Family Coach offers ways for you and your loved one to connect with support. I didn't use the app a whole lot. The tracking tools were kind of nice. I kind of got overwhelmed though, or wouldn't go to it when I needed mindfulness things. I just went to what I was used to doing, my prayer practices or stretching and stuff like that. But it's out there and a tool that you could definitely look into if you're needing something. And I think with the mindfulness exercises, you can kind of scroll through and find one that works. It gives you different ideas to try, which is helpful. The last app is the PTSD Coach that Brian had used, and I think that's also through the VA. I'll let him tell you more about that one.
PTSD Coach is an app intended for survivors, for the person who has PTSD. It's very similar to the PTSD Family Coach app, again made by the VA. I found the symptom tracking to be pretty helpful over time to see how my progress with PTSD had gone up or gone down. And the exercises to cope with symptoms were pretty useful, especially in the beginning when I didn't know what to do and hadn't had a lot of practice. And plus, it's right there on your phone. You can just flip to it instead of going to social media or zoning out on videos. You can just click that and do something constructive. I've done a video about it. I'll link that at the end of this video if you want to see more about that app.
The next resource is Loving Someone with PTSD by Aphrodite Matsakis, a practical guide to understanding and connecting with your partner after trauma. So that's the book. It's not super big. This book covers what is PTSD and your relationship, basic communication skills, talking about difficult subjects and making decisions together, managing triggers and trigger reactions, crises, which covers panic attacks, rage reactions, domestic violence, addiction, and suicide, PTSD, therapy and you, and helpful resources. And what it says on the inside cover is the purpose of this book is to help you find ways of being supportive of your partner and coping with your PTSD-related relationship problems that take into account not only your partner's PTSD, but your needs as well. There are a lot of exercises in this book. You start with the story of your current relationship, asking, how did you meet? What attracted you to him or her? What made you decide to commit? When did the trauma occur, before or after you were in the relationship? So those kinds of things to work through and talk about the early part of your relationship. There's exercises to identify your feelings about your relationship, even if they are confusing or conflicting, and how you think about your relationship in relationship to those feelings. Do you jump to negative conclusions because of that? You work through identifying your loved one's symptoms and how it affects your relationship, and scaling those symptoms from they don't bother you at all to extremely disruptive and troublesome to you. And then through a series of questions, you can more effectively look at how PTSD affects your feelings towards your partner, your relationship, and yourself. You work on recognizing your resentments and disappointments and establishing positive goals for your relationship, realizing communication pitfalls, facing your feelings, and how to have difficult discussions. There's also a section on identifying triggers and how they affect you, figuring out helpful approaches, as well as identifying your needs and creating a self-care plan when triggers happen. I got this book from one of the VA therapists when I was seeing them for a few sessions. They recommended it to me, and I started working my way through the book, trying to do the exercises during late night feedings and with our youngest. I can't say that I got the most out of it because of the timing and the juggling of kids and stuff like that. So I'm rereading it now. But it is really great with lots of practical information to help with common situations when you're dealing with PTSD. A few sections that I want to highlight that helped me was just at the beginning identifying PTSD symptoms. Brian had not been diagnosed with PTSD for quite a while, even though we asked multiple times and were told, no, that's not what you're dealing with. So when he finally got diagnosed, I didn't know what was different. So it was nice to kind of read through and underline things and go, yep, okay, this is what we've been dealing with all along. It just, we weren't diagnosed at that time. So that was really helpful to me. Another thing that was useful was it described the PTSD cycle. And I had experienced this over the years, but never recognized it as a cycle. And so briefly what that is there's the hyper alert stage where they're reliving the trauma and they are hyper aroused. They described it as feel as if electricity is flowing through their veins and they're terrified of losing emotional control. And their functioning is almost impossible at this point because there's so many intrusive thoughts bombarding them. What it looks like from the outside is that he's touchy or overly dramatic or freaking out over nothing. So I remember seeing that. The next stage is numbing or avoidance, where there are attempts to avoid and numb the trauma and they kind of shut down. So there's a lessening of emotions. Functioning is a little easier if it's not too severe, but they might be at a slower pace. And what that looks like to the outsider is they're underreacting or not reacting at all, can seem uncaring, self-absorbed, or selfish. And they're aware of this numbing of emotions and they start to try to hype themselves up to get back to feeling things, and then another trigger comes along and they go right back into that cycle. So that was helpful to kind of look back and see that that was something we had experienced and still do sometimes. The last thing I'd like to highlight from this book that I found really heartening to read was a section called The Courage to Love. And after so many times when I would reach out to friends and kind of talk about relationship struggles and kind of get the responses that were troubling, you know, kind of these odd looks or the, wow, that isn't okay or normal, or the hardest one to hear is, why are you still with him? I started to feel like I was going crazy or was crazy for sticking with Brian and working through our relationship. So when I read this section, it was really nice, and the author quotes psychologist Rollo May. Courage is needed because loving someone means opening yourself up to that person. And in an intimate relationship, one must open themselves up on an ongoing basis to their partner. This takes considerable inner strength, even under good circumstances. Establishing and maintaining an emotionally and physically rewarding relationship is challenging. Normal for all relationships. They go on to say, loving someone with PTSD requires a special kind of courage and dedication. And I kind of took a moment and felt like I could give myself a pat on the back and acknowledge the hard work that I had been putting in, and it was not crazy. So this book has good practical information on how to navigate PTSD, common problems, as well as identifying your own feelings and needs to better care for yourself, as well as for your partner. This was the information I had been looking for all those years ago, and I still have some ways to go to read and learn. The last resource I want to share with you all is a podcast called Married to PTSD. I found it on Google Podcasts, but I believe they're on other podcast platforms out there. One thing about this journey is that it has been particularly isolating. And so when I found this podcast the summer of 2021, I finally felt less lonely. I binge listened to it while I was doing a house project, and there were times I'd have to break because I was crying and just feeling all the emotions. It's two military wives that do the podcast, and they just talk about their experiences with their spouses who have PTSD. They share their own unique stories navigating PTSD, using medication or managing without medication, working with the VA, service dogs, resources that worked or didn't work for them, how they care for themselves and their kids, or how they're struggling. They just share the good and the bad. They also read letters from listeners telling their stories or asking questions. They aren't therapists or doctors, just fellow wives that are navigating similar situations. It was a relief to hear some of the same struggles and the courage that they had to keep on with their relationships, and just being encouraging of each other and other spouses in that situation. They also started a Facebook group, also called Married to PTSD, and it's slowly growing. I have found this group to be supportive. People will post about whatever they're struggling with, so others can rally around them and let them know they're not alone, or offer ideas if you have any. Post questions or resources, successes. It's really supportive. It primarily consists of military spouses, but PTSD symptoms are kind of the same across the board. And coping with that is hard, regardless of how the trauma happened. So some of the resources on there or questions maybe relating to VA or something may not apply to non-veteran families, but it is a great group for me so far. You can check it out. Overall, it's been positive and a good community. Those are the resources that have been helpful for us. Do you have any that have worked for you? Put them in the comments.
Thanks, baby.
You're welcome.